Okay, let's go.
It's about that time, so we're just gonna get started. So welcome everyone to Beginner's Guide to Embellishing Your Cosplay. This personally is my first ever panel that I'm doing, so let me know if you guys have feedback on how I'm presenting so I can make any other panels I may potentially do at FanExpo or other conventions better. So we're just gonna get started with a little bit about me, because as the little statistic earlier showed, a lot of you probably don't know who the hell I am and how I'm qualified to even be teaching you anything about this. So I am Circuit, or Circuit Period Cosplays on most social medias. I have been cosplaying for about 11 years. FanExpo Vancouver was my first ever convention back in 2013, 2012. And I was in the competition yesterday. So if you recognize this coat, that is why. This project alone logged over 500 hours of beading and embroidery. So I felt confident enough after doing this beast of a project to share some of my wisdom, because as I was making this project, I was getting a lot of questions online by friends and strangers alike online about how I was doing what I was doing. And how easy and level entry it was, because I want to show that adding embellishments to cosplays, whether you thrifted them, whether you bought them, whether you're making them by hand, or any other combination of, how easy and level entry it is, and often at times inexpensive it is, to throw a little bit more pizzazz and a little bit more shimmer onto those cosplays to make them look really good in things like photos or on stage or what have you. So we're just gonna get started into the embroidery, because that is the base for pretty much any needlework you're ever going to do. Even if it's just standard hand sewing, a lot of the stitches are very similar. So a little bit about embroidery shows that it is the most entry-level type of extra embellishment, and most certainly is the cheapest. You can often find materials at the dollar store or local thrift stores, sometimes even estate sales, because old people love cross-stitch and it's all the same materials. Now, all you need to get started in embroidery is an embroidery needle. Sometimes you can even use a regular needle if it's thick enough, depending on how many strands of the embroidery floss you're going to be using. However, they are often a bit thicker than standard sewing needles, and a little bit more blunter because it pushes through the fabric versus slicing through the fabric. They also have a larger eye to make it easy to thread for those really thick stitches you want to do. Most stitches are very similar to one another. They just change up slightly. So like a stem stitch is very similar to a back stitch, which is very similar to a running stitch kind of thing. So once you know one, you know a bunch of them. You just have to kind of practice and get the finesse of doing like the right tension and stitch length. And you don't have to use all 6 strands. So when you buy embroidery floss, like what's pictured on the slide, it comes in, it's like a thin rope with multiple different, with about 6 strands to it. And you can actually split that apart to get finer details. That's how I did a lot of the thicker and finer lines on the coat here. So like these chain stitches around the peacocks, we're using 6. The little tiny little poof on the top was done with 2 or 3. So you get more depth and dimension in your pieces. So that different stitches just look better with different amounts of thread. So the first stitch I want to look at is the basic of basic stitches. If you have done regular hand sewing, this is probably the one that you use or learned first. It's basically just going in and out of the fabric, almost like a bit of a wave. So I also have little video demonstrations to show different stitches. So that would be this one, if it wants to play for me. There we go. I filmed these all at 2 a.m. in my bedroom, so don't judge the filming quality.
It's
Is
black.
It not working? Oh no! Darn! Why is it not play? I was horrified of this. This is my worst nightmare. Why you no work anymore. Where's the tech guide? Oh, did I fix it?
Oh, it's back to the first slide.
Yeah, it says the first slide on my thing. Oh. Why is it showing video now? We'll see how it goes. Okay, maybe we won't have video, but that's okay, I guess. That just kind of sucks because the video doesn't want to play. But anyways, as I said, it's just like a wave. You just go in through the fabric, over a little bit, and back down again. And you just do that over and over and over again. To tie off your stitches, personally, what I like to do, because I don't like the actually visual way, I don't feel like it's secure enough, but it definitely does work. I'm just paranoid, is I'll split the threads apart and I'll tie little knots. Because I like knowing that it's not going to go anywhere, especially when I'm lining the project, because it's really hard to get into, which is why on this one, which feel free to steal this idea, on the bottom of the lining I installed Velcro, so I don't have to seam rip anything if I lose some beads, because that's a pain in the ass. Pardon my language. And now the next one's the back stitch. The back stitch is very similar. You just go up, over, down, and then you go back about halfway through the last stitch you did, up, and you just repeat that. If that makes any sense. So you go up, over, down, halfway back to the stitch, through the last stitch you did, up, over a little bit more, and then you come back up where that last stitch went down. I think I'm explaining that. Yeah, I'm seeing nods. Okay, good. Next we have a satin stitch, which is also very similar. It's just you're doing it, instead of going forward, you're going next to each other. So typically I like to do this with anywhere between with how thick I want it, anywhere between 2 to 3 threads to up to 6. I find it doesn't really work as well if you use one, just because the needles are often so thick it ends up leaving holes on either side depending on what type of fabric you're using, especially if you're using like a thick upholstery fabric like this. If you're using something thinner, then you might be able to get away with it, but I do recommend doing a couple more strands for your stitch. And you just kind of go over it until you cover, because sometimes you're not always going to get, if you don't get the next stitch directly next to it, there will be a little bit of a gap, but there is absolutely no shame in going back and covering it. You can't really tell unless you do it like 8 times. Then it starts to get a little wonky looking, but there's a lot of room for error with embroidery, and it's fantastic. And then for things like little dots, or sometimes flower buds, or like the little bases of flowers that the pollen comes out of, I see it used for a lot, are called French knots. So this one is a little bit harder to do. It's the hardest thing, I think, in this panel, where you take your needle, you go up through the fabric, and then you wrap your thread around it 2 to 3 times or so, and then you stick it back down in the fabric right where you pulled it up from, and you just kind of pull that top, and it'll make cute little knots, just like on the little picture. It is a little bit more tedious because sometimes I do it and I feel like I need a third hand, but it is feasible, and it just takes a bit more practice than say like a running stitch or a back stitch or anything like that. Let's get through all the videos because they're not working. Next, onto the glitter, because I love shimmering on stage. If you saw me yesterday, you know I like to sparkle. So a little bit about beading. It does take a lot more time to do, but it is so worth it. It is so worth it. You'll be doing it thinking it's not worth it. It is worth it. It is always worth it to add shimmer, especially if you want to hide mistakes in your embroidery, which is exactly what I did here. So for reference to how the time difference is, I sew at a pretty decent rate, and the embroidery on this entire project took about 150 to 200 hours. Meanwhile, the beading took almost 400. But that's also because I covered every little bit of embroidery with the beading. You don't have to go crazy like that. I'm just absolutely insane. So to do the beading, you may want to invest in a good vacuum, because as my girlfriend will attest, you drop beads sometimes. They are a lot easier. It is a lot easier with sparkle to clean up than say glitter, because you will not catch me dead using actual loose glitter, but I will bead anything to the high heavens, because beads you can vacuum, glitter you cannot. Sometimes you can get away with duct tape, but even that, it'll always be with you. So like if you're gonna be beading in say grandma's car or something, way better than touching glitter. So it is definitely a fun way to add sun-catching glimmer. So even if you're not wanting to do stage or do photos, it just looks really cool in the sun. You see all the cosplayers up over at the torch every con, and how the sun just hits some of them really prettily. A lot of that has to do with things like beads. And beads, you can also add to things like bot costumes. So I'm looking at you Genshin cosplayers. You can add so much pizzazz and glitter. I have friends who do it to their bot cosplays and it looks so pretty. Now, all you need to get started with beading, it's even more entry level in terms of finding the supplies, because you just need some little beads, a needle that will go through them with thread, and some polyester thread. Don't make the mistake I did and think all thread is the same, because it's not. Do not use cotton thread if you're using sharp beads, because it will slice right through it, and then you'll be a week away from competition and be like, why are all my beads falling off? Don't be like me. What I really like to use in terms of thread for beading is actually outdoor tent thread. You can buy it, I know you can buy it at Overseas Fabrics in Abbotsford. It comes on a spool exactly like the one pictured there. It looks exactly the same. The spool just might be a little bit of a different color, but it's all the same thing. You want that polyester because it's harder for those beads to cut through. Now, not all beads will do that. Sometimes it is only like the really sharp edge ones, but you can usually tell on the tube if they're gonna cut through. The more rounded ones, like the seed beads, typically fine. You can use whatever thread for those, typically. That's what I use for these, just regular cotton thread, and it worked great. Now the different types of beads. There are way too many different types of beads for me to cover. We just simply do not have the time. The most common you'll see though, that I've seen in stores, are the 6, 7 millimeter and 2 millimeter bugle beads, which are the long, sharp edge ones that you see, like the gold ones on my slide here. Those ones will cut through your thread, because sometimes they break when you manufacture them, and you don't always notice that they're really sharp when you go to sew them. You can also find the beads in a large array of materials. They're not all glass. You can use clay. You can make your own out of Warbler, I've seen people do. Foam clay even. You can use glass, plastic. The dollar store has some pretty nice ones a lot of the time, so you don't always have to go to Michael's or all the way down to Hobby Lobby. Wherever you get your beads, you can use them. You don't need to always use the little guys. You can use like the big guys depending on the effect you want, and mash them together into some Frankenstein applique piece. Just kind of go with the type of material you think fits best for what you're specifically wanting to do. You are the one with the creative liberty in your projects. So even if I'm saying, yeah, you know, this works best, it works best for me and for my projects. It might not work best for you. So feel free to take what I'm saying and bend it a little bit to suit your needs. As long as it works and it stays on, that's the important part. And as long as you like it, who else cares if it's really done correctly to standard, especially if you're not in competition. If you're in competition, then it gets a little bit more, because the judges look at that kind of thing sometimes, depending on the competition. But we're not going to be getting into the competitions. Now, sewing beads on. Sewing beads on looks a bit harder than it actually is, especially if you're doing things like straight lines and swirls and things like that. It's pretty much just doing a back stitch, but you're adding beads to it. So you go up to the fabric, you add a few beads on there, depending on what type of bead. So typically what I did for this project is if I used the long bugle bead, I put 2 on at a time. And if I did the smaller ones, I did about 4 to 6. Just because I find it's more secure that way and you're not getting like a lot of movement in where the beads sit. So you go up, throw your beads on, over to where they lay flat. You can kind of use your fingers to kind of see where it'll lay nicely before you stick it down to use the beads to measure. You go down and they go halfway through where the beads are. So that's where I like to use even numbers because, you know, it just sits nice in my brain. So if you use the 2, you go up through the 2 and you just slide your bead back through those last beads closest to the end of where you're sewing towards. And then you add a few more and you just keep going until you're done. With securing your beads at the end, like you're done, you're sewing, because normal thread for beading doesn't typically split like embroidery floss does. You do kind of have to do it the standard way that I've learned, which is essentially, say you have the end of your stitch. You use your needle to go under and then up, and you'll get a little loop from the rest of your thread. You just take your needle, you go through that loop. Sometimes I like to go through it again to secure it to more like, there's a type of knot that the name is slipping me right now where you tie it twice and it's more secure. Just do that a couple times and it's secure enough. Square knot, thank you. Yeah, square knot. It'll work totally fine. There we go. All right. So we're gonna skip this because that went by way faster than I anticipated. So, does anyone have any questions for me? Maybe about beading, maybe about embroidery, maybe about sequins. You shout because I have hearing loss. A recommended length of thread for beading? Oh, thread material. Recommended thread material for recommended thread material for beading? Recommended thread material for beading is polyester and nylon. So that's why I like to stick to things like tent thread, because that will always be nylon, because tents are made of nylon. I find it's a lot sturdier, and I find that beads are less likely to cut through it if whatever bead you happen to have on the end is a sharp one because it's gotten chipped in manufacturing and you didn't notice. And also, not all beads are going to be the same, especially glass beads, seed beads. There are so many weird looking ones. You can pick them out if that's what you want, if you want them all to be uniform, or you can have them all on there as long as the needle goes through. If you have weird looking beads, no one's gonna notice. My girlfriend collects them. You know, sorry to call you out. Yes, you.
How do you feel about silk embroidery?
Silk embroidery? Silk embroidery is so stunning, and I want to learn it. It is so pretty. Anything else? You in the front. Keeping the embroidery tidy? You just go back and finesse it. Look between every couple of stitches or every stitch, depending on how nervous you are about it, and see if the thread is going all the way through, because that's where a lot of the mess happens. You get like a little knot in the thread and it gets caught. Yeah. Sometimes you can kind of like massage it out a little bit. Sometimes if the loop, the nest is big enough, there's a big loop. Sometimes I just cut those out. And then I just start again. I just secure where I did and then just start again. And you had a question? I saw your hand first. It can. It does and it doesn't, depending on what type of beading you're wanting to do and what type of fabric. More delicate fabrics like chiffon, you really want to be careful and like take your time doing it, especially because it's see-through. So if you do have a mess on the back, it can and will be seen. Things like that are more opaque and thick, you have a bit more wiggle room because, especially fabrics that are self-healing, because if you stick and you're like, oh, that's not where I wanted that, oops, and you pull your needle out, it will heal the hole again, because not all fabrics do that. Not all fabrics are the same. If that answers your question. You with the headphones. Like how much time? Okay, so if you're like satin stitching a big piece, really, there's no way to do it other than you just use a lot of thread. And you just, if you really want that big piece to be satin stitched, you're gonna be sitting there satin stitching. Just get a big embroidery hoop. Because as long as you have a big enough embroidery hoop to fit your design, or even most of it, because a lot of this I just pieced together right with a small one. It depends how wide the biggest length is. That's what you're gonna want to measure your embroidery hoop off of, with a bit of room on the side. So when you put something on an embroidery hoop, because I totally forgot to mention this, you wanna make sure that you have tension on all the way around. All the way around, because otherwise you're gonna get some weird warbles, especially if you're satin stitching. Because when you put it on, it acts almost like a drum. With how a drum works, how they keep it taut, because you really want your fabric to be nice and taut around your embroidery hoop when you're satin stitching, especially. That's really important. So if you have, like, sometimes you can get away with it, but I wouldn't really recommend it. Where you have, like, your fabric is too small, like your design goes all the way to here. There are really tiny embroidery hoops you can get that are like that big. I have a couple. They're great. I love them so much. Any other questions? You. What I do in that scenario is every couple of stitches I retighten it. So a lot of embroidery hoops, not all embroidery hoops will keep your fabric straight. As you stitch, it will loosen up, so you're going to be adjusting it every once in a while. Just every couple of stitches, what I do is I will pull the edges and I will strengthen it more to get the best result. If the embroidery hoop doesn't fit, I'll find what fits the best and kind of try and piece it together. You can sew more fabric onto it, but you don't want to baste it. You want to actually be sewn, because the tension could rip those stitches apart. Yes, please. Quilters have my respect. Ooh, that's really smart. Thank you, wise one. You in the Star Trek uniform. Okay, so beading needles. Really quick rundown. There are different types of beading needles. There are beading needles for making jewelry, and there's beading needles for fabric. Be sure you get the ones for fabric and not the ones for beading, because those ones are super weird. Because the ones for jewelry, the entire body is the eye of the needle, which can cause problems if you're sewing through fabric. You can lose your thread easier because there's just so much space to lose it. They are easier to thread, but it's not worth it. Where I buy my needles, I get the 30 packs on Amazon, but I'm sure you can find them in other bead stores around. I like to get most of my supplies on Amazon because I usually need them in a pinch. Any other questions? Yes, you. So when you're patterning the design on your fabric, what I did for this, and what I like to do, is I'll use a heat erase pen. Alternatively, the exact same thing, often cheaper, are erasable pens you can find at Staples, because they erase by friction, which is just another way of saying heat. Because you can buy one heat erase pen from Fabricland for $10, or you can buy 6 of them in rainbow colors at Staples. Also, what I like to do though, especially for bigger pieces like this, where there's a lot of fine detail, is there's this transfer paper stuff you can get that's like a big sticker that's water dissolvable. So that's how I did things like the sun here and the moon on one of the front panels. I just like to make sure to do the outside edge first because I do find it likes to come off after pretty quickly. So I do the outside edge to secure it down, and then I go in and do all the rest. And then I wash it off in the sink, and it just dissolves right away. Trying to get someone who hasn't done the question. You with the hair bow. How much supplies I need for beading? That really depends on what your project is. However, I will say, if you think you have enough, you do not. It is best to have more and return it to Michael's than have not enough and find out that your beads you can't actually buy in bulk, and even though you went across country borders to find some, and you can't, and you have to do half of your project in a different type of bead. And not at all speaking from experience. Questions? Anyone else who's not had questions first? You! You can, but your hands will hate you. Beading on leather, I honestly don't know if beading needles can get through it without snapping. Because I was just getting through this upholstery fabric, and I went through 2 different beading needles trying to get through some of the parts on this. If the leather is thin enough, then you probably could get away with it. Just keep in mind that leather does not self-heal, so any holes you put in it will stay. So you have to be very sure before you really pull the needle all the way through that that's where you want that stitch, that's where you want those beads to go. Any other questions? You with the ears. To wash it? There is a little costuming trick that I like to do, especially on wardrobe pieces. So that's what this is going to be going under. I like to mix water with a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio of just bottom shelf vodka. You throw that in a spray bottle and you spray down your garment on the inside, and it removes odor and it removes bacteria. It sanitizes it. And then any food stains on the front of your garment, like say you're doing a coat like this, for example, you spray the inside down with the alcohol. You can give the outside a bit of a spray if it gets a little musty in storage, and then you spot clean any food stains. Because this, unless you really go over your beads many times, I would not recommend throwing in the washing machine because that can be very delicate. Even just sometimes the beads scraping up against one another can pull them off, and then you're going to be having to redo a lot of your beads, or just live with it that way, depending on how much you care. Questions? You! Beginner-friendly fabric. Beading fabric, beading friendly fabric.
Beginner friendly.
Beginner friendly. For practicing, I want to say things like felt you can get at the craft store and the dollar store sometimes are really good for beading specifically. I know a lot of cosplayers do a lot of their applique pieces that they sew on later with felt, and they cover it with the beads, and then they'll apply it. Especially if it's just for practice, it doesn't super matter what type of fabric you're using. Just don't use stretch fabric. My God, don't do that to yourself, because the places you embroider and the places you bead on stretch fabric will not stretch anymore. So if you have a pair of tight pants that you want to put like some cool veiny designs on, paint them or do something else. Do not satin stitch them with a machine. Do not hand sew embroidered leaves on it, because it will not stretch and it'll fit weird. Unless that's what you want. You know, sometimes I can't control what you want to do with your costumes, and that's totally okay. Any other questions? You again. Just going slowly. A lot of times, my biggest problem I had with knots happening came from I was going too fast, and I didn't notice that the thread wrapped around itself, and that's how the knot happened. So sometimes if you pull back a little bit and just kind of massage it with your fingers out, you can undo those loops. You just want to be able to catch it before you go on to the next stitch, because then it's a real pain in the ass to take out.
Most of those loops are almost always slip knots, so you can pull one of the straps and get it out.
Yeah, slip knots, yeah. Any other questions for me? We still have like 15 minutes. Yes, you again.
Should you match your embroidery flap with floss? Should you match your embroidery floss to the type of material?
That entirely depends on the effect you want. So if you want contrast and to be able to see the embroidery really well against the fabric, then I'd recommend doing something a different color. If you want a very subtle texture effect, which I know a lot of people do, especially on cosplays for like Game of Thrones, where they have a lot of intricate embroidery that are very subtle, they will do a thread that's very close to the color of your fabric. It all depends on the effect you want. The material. The material, again, as I said before, it's really again up to what you want in your effect. Certain fabrics work better with embroidery, like don't use stretch if you can help it, because stretch sucks. Self-healing fabrics, especially if you're just starting out, is really nice, which you can actually bring a little needle into the fabric store and poke through the fabric a little bit in the corners and see how well it heals. Sometimes a lot of fabrics that don't naturally self-heal, if you take it on the bias and you wiggle it, it will put those threads back into place, especially if you're using a regular threading needle that kind of just pushes the threads apart. Which is how, because this fabric isn't very good at self-healing on the coat, so if I messed up a bit, I wiggled it and it went away. It was really great. Any other questions for me? You in the back. A favorite project? A favorite project to work with?
Creator.
Oh, as a cosplay creator, a favorite project to work with? This one. This has been my pride and joy for the past 2 years. I have spent so many tears, tragic blood stains, not necessarily my own blood. Sometimes it was fake blood. There was a really unfortunate incident about a month ago with some fake blood in this coat. Thankfully, my mom was able to clean it out with some dish soap. Yeah, go mom! Any other questions? Oh. You!
How do you
Thread from fraying when you're like stitching it.
The thread from spraying when I stitch it. Like the end of your thread. Sometimes, especially if it's a project for me, don't necessarily do this if you're commissioning somebody, because it can be a little gross, especially in these pre-COVID days. Sometimes I'll just lick the end. I'll just go, ugh, and it fixes it for a bit. And if I notice it's coming apart again, I go, ugh. You can also just dip your fingers in water and do that if you don't want to do that. That's totally up to you, what you're comfortable with doing to your cosplays and cosplays you're doing for friends. I just, I'm the only one who's going to wear this, so I don't care. That, and if you wash it and sanitize it with that alcohol water spray I was talking about, it doesn't matter anyways. Anything else? You.
Can you use embroidery stitches to hem up any edges of the cosplays?
A lot of the stitches are very similar. So like a running stitch, absolutely, you can. Yeah. It really depends on how many folds you're doing on the hem of your garment. If you're doing one fold, you just do a running stitch. If you're doing multiple, you could, I guess, do like a back stitch. If you want it to be a very decorative hem, especially on the outside of your garment, absolutely. You can do whatever stitch you want on that hem. Anything else? No? Alrighty. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about sequins, because I wanted to talk about sequins. I was just scared I wouldn't have the time. So sequins! Who loves sequins? Yeah, I got a couple sequin likers in the crowd. There are so many different types of sequins you can get. It's awesome, and they're so inexpensive. It's great. So you can get sequins out of so many different materials. Plastic sometimes. These ones on here are made out of beetle wings, which are really cool. Yeah, beetle wings, right? I have a friend who came up and was like, hey, I made this dress out of beetle wings. Want some sequins? I was like, absolutely I do. To do those, you can do like little individual ones at a time, where I like to stitch on either, depending on how secure I'm wanting them, I'll do like one stitch. Like say you have the circle of sequin, I like to do a stitch here, and then a stitch here, and a stitch here, going into the hole, and that'll hold it really secure. Sometimes I'll do one loop if I want it to be able to flip, or just two if I'm doing it really quickly. Like say we're con crunching the day before the convention. Yeah, that's the type of one you want to do. Save a little bit of time. Or if you want to cover an area with sequins like I did on the top of here, that's called scaling, where you'll go and you'll get your sequin. You have one sequin here. You go up through your fabric, then you will do through the hole of your sequin, because you put the sequin on the needle, and that looked nasty. Go up, then over, down, then up into the sequin, add another sequin, and go a little over, and you just repeat that through the last hole. And then it'll create this really nice kind of fish scale look, especially if you have iridescent sequins, it looks really pretty. And the other way you can attach sequins individually that I like to do is I'll add a bead. That'll hold those suckers on there so well, you don't even need to stitch them down. You go up through the fabric with your needle, you slap a sequin on there, you slap a bead on top, and you go back down the hole of the sequin. And that ain't going nowhere. And it adds some really nice texture too. If you want something more tactile, like say you're really fidgety and you like touching things. Sometimes, yeah. Or you like touching things on your cosplay when you're like waiting in line for the badge pickup, like that line we saw on Saturday. Oh my God. You want things to do, you want to play with things. Those beaded sequins do the trick, man. Does anyone have any questions about sequins? No? You do, okay. Sequins you can find so many places. You can find them in craft stores. Sometimes you can find them on Amazon. Sometimes you can catch them in dollar stores, depending on the dollar store you have locally. If you buy enough craft supplies at your dollar store, they'll bring more in, which is great. Like I think I single-handedly working on this coat changed the statistics at my local dollar store, because they had one pack of embroidery thread in that dollar store, and I went in there a couple months ago to get some more, and they had so many more colors of the exact same type of thread I buy. So that goes to show how much thread you need. Anything else? No? Alrighty. So again, if any of you want to have a look at my little sample piece here, now that you kind of know what the different stitches are, pretty much all of the ones I went in this panel are pretty exclusively the only ones I used on this coat, except for like a stem stitch, which is a little bit more advanced, but you should definitely all look up, because I absolutely love the stem stitch. It is so versatile. You can do straight lines, you can do circles, you can do swirlies. It's so nice. Yeah, you can come up, you can feel, you can identify some of the stitches, use some of that knowledge I just gave you. I did have samples made that I was going to pass out to the crowd, that like as I was speaking you could like see the stitch and feel it and see how it was done, but I forgot those all at home. And I realized yesterday, and I forgot my embroidery hoop, so I couldn't make more. Yeah. But thank you all so much for coming to my panel. Oh, shoot, I forgot about, if you want to find me later, you can scan the QR code or follow me on one of these little @s here. I do have a link tree on the QR code with this slideshow. So if there's information on this slideshow that you want later, you can absolutely take it. I'm giving it to you for free. This is my gift to you this Valentine's Day season.